everyone. Buonasera, buon pomeriggio a tutti. I'm glad to meet you here in Pisa. We had some technical problems, but I hope they will be compensated by the beauty of this botanical garden, which is indeed the oldest botanical garden in Europe. So I hope you can have also the time to have a look at it. And I do not want to waste any time. We have here our director of the department, Professor Simone Collavini, who will give us our greeting. And I must say that yesterday I met a Korean student, now a professor in the University of Siena, who discussed the PhD with you, and so he told me to send his best wishes. So thank you.
Welcome everybody. Take my speech in Italian. I'm sorry, I am not prepared something in English. So, benvenuti a tutti, soprattutto a chi viene da più lontano, qui a Pisa, in questo bellissimo luogo che è il giardino botanico della nostra università. Come diceva Chiara, ha una lunga storia alle spalle, è anche uno dei posti più piacevoli dove trascorrere questi pomeriggi molto caldi, quindi magari qualcuno di voi scapperà a metà della conferenza per fare un giro fra le piante. È un motivo di orgoglio come direttore del Dipartimento di Civiltà e Forme del Sapere ospitare questo incontro, portarvi i miei saluti. È uno dei motivi di soddisfazione maggiore per un direttore del dipartimento molto ampio. Siamo più di 100 docenti, molto articolato al suo interno. Si va dalla storia contemporanea all'orientalistica, all'archeologia preistorica, dalla storia dell'arte alla storia medievale, dall'archeologia al cinema e lo spettacolo. Quindi direttore ha l'occasione di incontrare persone che vengono da tante parti del mondo, che studiano tante cose diverse. Noi crediamo che questa varietà di studi che coltiviamo nel nostro dipartimento non sia una debolezza, ma sia una nostra forza. Le discipline umanistiche, continuiamo a credere, le persone si formano a degli specialismi anche molto spiccati come quelli che caratterizzano questo convegno, ma gli specialismi funzionano se abbiamo intorno una cultura generale nella quale inserirli. Per gli studenti, per i giovani studiosi e per noi studiosi un po' più maturi ormai con la barba bianca, mantenere un orizzonte il più ampio possibile nelle discipline umanistiche resta, secondo me, la chiave fondamentale. Ciò detto, è ovvio che lo specialismo è fondamentale. Sono contento di portare i saluti come direttore per la prima volta ufficialmente a Chiara, l'ho già fatto tante volte, vincitrice di questo importante progetto, che in questo dipartimento va avanti in questa tradizione. Stiamo vivendo una fase di grande ricambio. Andiamo a perdere più di metà dei professori ordinari del dipartimento in 6 o 7 anni. Per fortuna, dietro le persone un po' più anziane e quelle di mezza età come me, ci sono giovani come Chiara che portano avanti le tradizioni del nostro dipartimento nel migliore dei modi. E il tema che è al centro del vostro seminario non è certo uno dei temi nei quali ho competenze. Io sono uno storico medievale, ma molto concentrato sull'orizzonte europeo, non sui grandi orizzonti internazionali, però è un tema di cui posso capire qualche cosa una volta tanto rispetto ad altri seminari che introduco e coglierne l'importanza, l'interesse sia all'interno della nostra contemporaneità, ripresa di questi contatti, scambi culturali tra mondi diversi, globalizzazione, crisi della globalizzazione che stiamo vivendo proprio in questi mesi, di fronte agli accendersi di steccati e barriere, quanto è importante portare avanti questo dialogo. E ovviamente poi la dimensione più specificamente scientifica di questo progetto, che è importante perché si pone dal mio punto di vista di direttore, in una soglia che per noi è fondamentale, quella dell'interdisciplinarietà, la capacità di superare le barriere interdisciplinari unendo storia antica, storia delle religioni, studio delle lingue orientali, ma anche un rapporto forte col mondo delle scienze dure, ingegneria informatica. Quindi massima soddisfazione, tante persone diverse, che studiano cose diverse e si incontrano qui. E poi, visto che Chiara l'ha ricordato proprio poco fa, il piacere di non rincontrare, perché non lo incontro, ma di vedere nel programma un dottorando coreano, un ragazzo che ha fatto il dottorato venendo dalla Corea in storia medievale, imparando al contempo l'italiano e il latino nei 3 anni di dottorato, un ragazzo eccezionale che partecipa anche lui a questo progetto, seppure nella versione del convegno senese, quindi è un piacere continuare a coltivare questi rapporti. Vi taccio perché sempre nei convegni la parte di salute istituzionale è la peggiore e più noiosa per tutti, e quindi la taglio in breve, ma voglio veramente rinnovare ancora una volta. Welcome everybody, buon lavoro, buon convegno.
Grazie. E allora io darei inizio ai lavori, chiamerei la collega bizantinista Luisa Andriollo, che ha accettato di presiedere questa sessione. La ringrazio e come vuole, guarda, puoi fare sì, sì.
Thank you. I also would like to thank Chiara for inviting me to share this session, and I'm sure I will learn a lot, as this, the topic of this conference is also quite far away from my field of research, but I'm very glad to attend it and share this session. So our first speaker is Ugo Baldini from the University of Padova. He will talk about la scienza occidentale trasmessa in Oriente, antichità e modernità. Ugo Baldini.
Grazie, buongiorno. Ho accettato questo incarico temerariamente perché il tema generale che mi è stato chiesto in qualche senso di introdurre è estremamente complesso, sfaccettato, articolato, e lo sviluppo degli studi negli ultimi decenni è enorme. Se vi consentite una reminiscenza personale, quando io cominciai a studiare gli scienziati gesuiti attorno al 1980, ci potevano essere, diciamo, 5 titoli di bibliografia italiana sull'argomento. Adesso abbiamo pubblicazioni destinate esclusivamente a elencare ciò che si scrive sul tema. E preparando questo intervento ho scoperto ulteriormente molte altre cose, quindi siamo di fronte a uno sviluppo esponenziale che ancora non accenna ad arrestarsi, anzi è ancora nella fase di pieno sviluppo. Essendo questa la situazione, io ho pensato di articolare questo intervento in 3 parti. Una prima parte destinata a chiarire il senso della nozione di globalizzazione relativamente alla scienza e perché i gesuiti ebbero un ruolo decisivo in questo processo. Sembra che sia ovvio, ma non lo è affatto. Secondariamente, intendo chiarire la nozione di scienza gesuitica. Se con l'espressione scienza gesuitica non intendiamo banalmente il semplice insieme di contenuti trasmessi dai gesuiti, ma intendiamo qualcosa di più specifico, cioè qualcosa che connoti internamente questi contenuti, in quanto specifici della Compagnia di Gesù, allora su questo va fatto un discorso. In terzo luogo, considererò i successi e le difficoltà dell'azione scientifica dei gesuiti nello specifico contesto cinese. e in particolare le difficoltà, perché l'esito fu notevolissimo e ha lasciato delle tracce estremamente precise, perfino nel lessico cinese, ma ci furono anche dei fallimenti altrettanto cospicui. E i fallimenti ci dicono quanto è più dei successi, cioè ci indicano i motivi profondi della comprensione e incomprensione fra civiltà. Allora, primo aspetto, globalizzazione. Questa parola è diventata di uso inflazionato. Dobbiamo tenere presente che se per globalizzazione intendiamo il passaggio di contenuti culturali da un contesto di civiltà a un altro contesto, la scienza europea classica era già di per sé globalizzata. Facendo riferimento alle semplici discipline matematiche, teniamo presente che l'astronomia greca deriva dall'astronomia mesopotamica, ma non solo, diciamo, dal punto di vista dei risultati delle conoscenze, dal punto di vista della strutturazione logica. Pensate al fatto banale che i greci hanno un sistema numerico decimale, ma hanno un sistema goniometrico duodecimale, preso dai babilonesi. E tutt'oggi noi abbiamo un sistema duodecimale per ciò che attiene alla goniometria e alla orologiografia. Terziariamente, una ulteriore fase di globalizzazione si ha al passaggio, diciamo, grosso modo, fra basso e alto medioevo, cioè fra alto e basso medioevo, con l'introduzione del sistema numerico che noi diciamo arabo e che in realtà, come sapete, è geneticamente di origine indiana. Questo avviene nel secolo XI-XII ad opera di vari autori, ma siamo a Pisa e diciamo essenzialmente Leonardo Pisano. Leonardo Fibonacci, mercante pisano ad Alessandria d'Egitto, che trasporta il sistema numerico arabo che è più adatto a fare i calcoli mercantili, e dai calcoli mercantili poi il sistema si estende all'intero campo dell'aritmetica. Il sistema numerico greco e romano, con differenze notazionali, ma logicamente si tratta della stessa cosa, era intrinsecamente limitato, non aveva lo zero e non era posizionale. Quindi il sistema numerico greco-romano era intrinsecamente incapace di dar luogo a sviluppi sofisticati in aritmetica, tantomeno all'algebra. Quindi la scienza antica, tra virgolette, che i gesuiti porteranno in Asia come altrove, non era tutta antica allo stesso modo. Era antichissima nel caso della goniometria, era antica nel caso della geometria, era un po' meno antica nel caso dell'aritmetica. Quindi non abbiamo a che fare con un blocco roccioso compatto, abbiamo a che fare con un terreno sedimentario. Ecco. Quindi la scienza europea era già globalizzata. Ciò che avviene con quelle che un tempo si chiamavano le scoperte geografiche, adesso non si può più dire perché quelli che vennero scoperti dissero avevamo scoperte prima noi, quindi non si può più dire. E ciò che avviene, diciamo, con l'espansione europea sugli oceani è che questo complesso sedimentario che stavo dicendo viene portato altrove con varie modalità. Una prima modalità che viene comunemente dimenticata, ed è quella più banale, più terra-terra, è l'astronomia e la nautica. I marinai navigano con gli astri e navigano ovviamente con strumenti per la rilevazione delle posizioni degli astri, hanno carte delle correnti, hanno carte dei venti. Tutto questo, sia pure in modo embrionale, è scienza. Un secondo aspetto della globalizzazione, che viene ugualmente spesso dimenticato, è l'architettura militare. In Africa, in America centrale e meridionale, in Asia, abbiamo centinaia di manufatti, cioè di fortificazioni spagnole o portoghesi, che sono scienza incarnata. Perché sono scienza incarnata? perché l'architettura militare, a differenza dell'architettura civile, non è semplicemente un insieme di nozioni atte a far stare in piedi un edificio. L'architettura militare deve far stare in piedi l'edificio, ma il suo scopo altrettanto essenziale è quello di minimizzare i danni dall'attacco esterno. E i danni dell'artiglieria sono un fatto balistico, cioè meccanico. E quindi il congegnamento dei muri, le angolazioni, le pendenze, eccetera, sono in sé un fatto scientifico. Non dimentichiamo che gran parte dell'architettura militare spagnola e portoghese nelle Americhe e in Africa è italiana. Gran parte degli architetti militari utilizzati nella prima fase dagli spagnoli e dai portoghesi erano di formazione italiana, perché la nuova architettura militare era nata in Italia. Allora, questo però ci riguarda secondariamente. Primariamente ci riguarda invece la scienza teorica. Il vettore principale di questa scienza teorica è la Compagnia di Gesù. Perché? Ricordiamo che la Compagnia di Gesù non nasce come ordine insegnante e nemmeno primariamente culturale, nasce come ordine missionario. Lo sviluppo verso l'istruzione si ha qualche decennio dopo, con la fondazione di scuole originariamente destinate alla formazione dei quadri interni della compagnia e poi aperte all'esterno. Il primo collegio formalmente per laici, chiamiamolo così, o per gesuiti e laici, è quello di Messina dal 1548. Quindi la peculiarità della compagnia è quella di essere insieme missionaria e didatta. Questa combinazione di caratteri non c'è in allo stesso livello, nella stessa misura, in nessun ordine religioso della cattolicità in quell'epoca. Gli altri ordini che hanno avuto un ruolo nell'insegnamento, nella storia della cattolicità, non so, diciamo i Beatini, diciamo i Somaschi, diciamo i Barnabiti, hanno un ruolo estremamente secondario a livello delle missioni. Un ruolo leggermente maggiore avranno gli Scolopi, ma gli Scolopi nascono a 600 già avviato e la loro azione missionaria si esplica dalla fine del 600 in poi. Quindi in sostanza i Gesuiti sono il vettore principale. Poiché lo sviluppo del colonialismo francese è più tardo rispetto a quello delle potenze iberiche, sostanzialmente non possiamo parlare di insediamenti stabili francesi in Canada, nelle Antille o altrove prima della metà del Seicento. Quindi la fase iniziale della globalizzazione concerne le colonie iberiche, quindi le Americhe, quindi l'Africa e quindi le Filippine e quindi l'Asia. Ciò che è importante tenere presente, con questo mi avvio a chiudere questa fase del mio discorso, sono le differenze essenziali fra queste zone, che fanno sì che la compagnia svolga un ruolo scientifico totalmente divaricato in ciascuna di esse. Perché? Nelle Americhe formalmente abbiamo dei territori che sono diventati proprietà degli stati europei, ma che in realtà sono europeizzati solo lungo le coste o in piccoli centri montani, nelle zone andine. I gesuiti agiscono come missionari presso gli amerindi e agiscono come didatti nelle scuole per i coloni o per i figli dei coloni. Tutto il sistema universitario dell'America Latina odierno all'80% deriva da antichi collegi gesuitici. Abbiamo il collegio gesuitico di Città del Messico già alla fine del Cinquecento, il collegio dell'Havana, il collegio di Panama, il collegio di Bogotà, il collegio di La Paz, il collegio di Quito, il collegio di Buenos Aires, il collegio di Lima e via discorrendo. Tutto questo fra ultimi anni del Cinquecento e i primi anni del Seicento. Quindi i gesuiti colti in questo particolare areale, in questa zona di missione, operano a beneficio degli europei, non a beneficio degli indigeni. Cioè non divulgano conoscenze presso le popolazioni locali, che sono estranee al meccanismo di istruzione. I missionari insegnano qualcosa, quelli che operano nel profondo dei territori, ma a livello scientifico il loro ruolo è relativamente secondario. Quindi in queste zone la compagnia divulga scienza europea per europei trapiantati altrove. La stessa cosa vale per l'Africa. Abbiamo in Angola il collegio di Luanda, già alla fine del Cinquecento, poco dopo in Mozambico, e la stessa cosa vale per l'India. Collegio di Goa, collegio di Cochin. I missionari che penetrano dentro i territori, quando anche abbiano una preparazione scientifica significativa, la usano semplicemente a scopo di orientamento e di sopravvivenza. Per esempio, tracciano l'idrografia per muoversi nei territori, tracciano l'orografia per orientarsi, mappano per sapere quanto distano da una certa altra località, ma non fanno della ricerca scientifica come scopo primario e tantomeno lo insegnano agli indios o agli indiani. Il collegio di Goa è frequentato dai figli degli hidalgos portoghesi e la stessa cosa a Cochin, con pochissimi convertiti indiani. Un fronte completamente diverso, che presenta una alta casistica e che viene quasi comunemente, quasi sempre del tutto ignorato, è un fronte europeo. Quando noi parliamo di scienza occidentale portata dai gesuiti altrove, in realtà parliamo di scienza dell'Europa occidentale. Non parliamo di scienza al di là di una certa linea che è all'incirca corrispondente alla confine fra Polonia e Ducato di Lituania. I gesuiti iniziano alla fine del Cinquecento un'opera di spostamento in avanti del fronte cattolico a danno del protestantesimo baltico e a danno dell'ortodossia, guadagnando circa 400 chilometri in meno di un secolo. La linea di insegnamento della cultura europea tradizionale fino alla fine del Cinquecento passa dalle 3 università di Uppsala, Königsberg, Cracovia. I gesuiti arrivano a Riga, arrivano al Lvov, arrivano a Cluj in Transilvania. Il loro impatto si può chiamare un impatto di globalizzazione, perché la cultura ortodossa, per quanto noi la sentiamo come qualcosa di molto vicino a noi per la sua genesi, in realtà dal punto di vista filosofico-scientifico era estremamente differenziata. Se voi prendete una storia delle matematiche, non trovate un contributo matematico russo, bielorusso, ucraino e polacco, al di là del caso particolarissimo di Copernico, che è un caso a sé, fino a 600 avanzato. Non c'erano scuole superiori in quest'area. Le scuole delle confraternite ortodosse erano scuole religiose con pochissimi elementi di vita comune, quindi calcolo, diciamo, per gli usi quotidiani, eccetera. I gesuiti, introducendo la loro didattica, introducono il latino, introducono la letteratura latina, introducono la nozione latina di retorica, ma introducono la filosofia aristotelica, che nell'area bizantina era nota in modo completamente diverso e parziale, e introducono l'insegnamento basilare scientifico proprio del loro ordine. Basta concludere su questo dicendo che una conseguenza di questo è l'abbandono del sistema cirillico di notazione numerica. Noi pensiamo al cirillico sempre in relazione all'alfabetico, ma Cirillo e Metodio avevano introdotto anche un sistema numerico derivato da quello greco, con una notazione molto simile, che aveva i limiti che dicevo prima del sistema romano e greco, quindi un sistema non posizionale. Nella Russia profonda il sistema numerico arabo viene recepito solamente ai primi del Settecento. Quindi c'è una globalizzazione attuata dai gesuiti anche in Europa, che ha delle sue caratteristiche particolari. E veniamo all'Asia. occorre distinguere molto accuratamente il caso indiano dal caso cinese. La differenza è data da circostanze politiche, da circostanze sociali e da circostanze culturali. Nel caso indiano abbiamo il centro-nord del subcontinente che è in mano all'impero Moghul, il quale ovviamente non consente un'opera di missione esplicita e diffusa, anche se diversi gesuiti risiederanno presso la corte imperiale. Inoltre, per quello che attiene invece all'India, chiamiamola tradizionale, cioè brahmanica, del centro-sud, i gesuiti impattano in una situazione particolare che non riescono a modificare, nella quale non incidono, che è l'esclusività della cultura superiore in mano al ceto dei bramini. L'esclusività della cultura che in Cina era un fatto attinente al ceto laico dei mandarini, in India era attinente a un ceto clericale. Questo produce una differenza fondamentale perché i bramini vedono i gesuiti come rivali, conseguentemente non si aprono con loro. C'è una lettera interessantissima del 1610 circa di Giovanni Battista Rubino, ex allievo di Clavio nel collegio romano, poi visitatore dell'India e infine morto in Giappone martire. E Rubino dice: io ho provato moltissime volte a capire cosa sanno i bramini in campo astronomico e matematico, ma non sono mai riuscito a farmi dire nulla. E c'era poi la barriera linguistica. Tutti i testi scientifici di tradizione indù erano in sanscrito e il sanscrito nel primo secolo di penetrazione europea è noto a pochissimi missionari. E tra essi non c'è nessuno di competenza matematica. Quindi in India ci fu tutta una serie di fattori, ne ho elencati alcuni ma ce ne sarebbero anche altri, che in qualche modo frenarono la possibilità di azione dei gesuiti. Il caso cinese è, come voi sapete, un caso completamente diverso e assume la trasmissione dei contenuti scientifici assume un ruolo del tutto prioritario ad opera di quella che potremmo chiamare la dottrina Ricci. È Matteo Ricci che intuisce che l'unico modo per aprire il forziere cinese è quello di mostrare la superiorità o almeno l'alto livello delle conoscenze occidentali, in particolare in un campo neutro, cioè neutro in senso filosofico e in senso religioso, che è costituito dalle discipline matematiche. E veniamo quindi al secondo aspetto fondamentale, cioè la nozione gesuitica di scienza. Ricordo che il diritto canonico proibiva e proibisce ai sacerdoti l'esercizio dell'avvocatura e della medicina. Quindi nelle scuole degli ordini non vi era nessun insegnamento che poteva essere afferente all'area medica. Non solo, ma nell'insegnamento della filosofia naturale aristotelica non erano considerati i testi di Aristotele a più marcata caratterizzazione naturalistica. Cioè i gesuiti trattavano nei corsi di filosofia la fisica, il decelo, il degenerazione e corruzione e le meteore. Quasi mai parva naturalia, mai le parti degli animali e la storia degli animali. Questi erano considerati testi di interesse naturalistico e quindi estranei all'obiettivo della compagnia. Dobbiamo quindi partire dall'idea che la formazione della gran parte dei missionari che vanno in Cina è una formazione che ha questo limite interno. Quando noi ci imbattiamo in un gesuita che ha competenze mediche o competenze naturalistiche, le ha perché prima di entrare nella compagnia aveva fatto studi medici o per interesse personale o per vicende familiari o per altri motivi. Ma questo è un caso abbastanza raro. Quindi l'azione fondamentale di trasmissione avviene nel campo delle discipline matematiche. intendendosi per discipline matematiche, le matematiche pure, l'astronomia, ma anche le applicazioni del tempo, l'acustica, l'armonia e una serie di altre cose. La planimetria, la distanziometria, lo studio delle distanze fra località e via discorrendo. Quando venivano studiate nel cursus queste cose? La ratio studiorum, la Bibbia, diciamo, del piano didattico dei Gesuiti, prevedeva l'insegnamento della matematica solamente nel secondo anno del triennio filosofico. In realtà il secondo anno bastava solamente ad affrontare alcuni temi. I giovani dotati, però, appartenenti alla compagnia, venivano indirizzati a corsi di perfezionamento privati che potevano durare anche alcuni anni. La gran parte dei missionari andati in Cina provenivano da questi corsi. Tuttavia, e questo è un punto che è nodale per capire successi e fallimenti, la nozione gesuitica di scienza non era corrispondente alla nostra, ma era quella aristotelica, cioè è l'episteme di Aristotele, vale a dire è un insieme di conoscenze dimostrative che si estendono dalla metafisica alla descrizione di fatti naturali. I Gesuiti erano tutti formati all'interno di questo disegno, di questa visione, perché dopo il triennio di filosofia seguivano il quadriennio di teologia scolastica, nella quale la metafisica era strumento fondamentale. Ed era scientifica perché era ritenuta in perfetta conseguenzialità logica con le discipline scientifiche nel senso nostro, cioè con le matematiche. Il nesso era costituito dalla logica sillogistica, con i suoi addentellati. La logica aristotelica, nella sua parte più comune e più banale, cioè quella che è più familiare a ciascuno di noi, nella fillogistica, ci presenta un modello di ragionamento con due proposizioni dalle quali ne segue una terza. Le due proposizioni o sono entrambe con predicati nominali, come sarebbe a dire A e B, B e C, quindi A e C, oppure sono una predicativa normale, per esempio Venanzio abita a Pisa, va bene? E un'altra invece con predicato nominale. I pisani sono italiani, dunque Venanzio è italiano. Questo strumento argomentativo si saldava nella logica di Aristotele e nella logica dei Gesuiti con altri strumenti, con altri scritti del filosofo, come le categorie di interpretazione, che sono il nesso con la metafisica di Aristotele. Buona parte dei Gesuiti era convinta della intrinsecità del nesso fra questi due aspetti, cioè fra le scienze matematiche nel senso odierno dell'espressione e quest'altro campo disciplinare. Quando però in Cina una parte di loro tentò di introdurre anche quest'altro aspetto, si ebbe un fallimento. Un caso classico, per esempio, è la versione di Ludovico Buglio della prima parte della Summa Theologiae dell'Aquinate e di parti della terza parte della Summa. 34 volumi di traduzione che non trovano lettori, o che se li trovano trovano dei lettori che a un certo punto rifiutano. Perché? Perché? Spesso si trova l'affermazione che i cinesi rifiutano ciò che non è scientifico ma è religioso, cioè sono respinti dal tentativo dei gesuiti di dimostrare la verità della loro fede, che considerano un tentativo, diciamo, arbitrario, non convincente. In realtà l'aspetto religioso viene rifiutato per il particolare tipo di strumenti con i quali viene presentato. Ricci ottiene conversioni sul piano etico, sul piano della cultura dei sentimenti, e così tutti gli altri missionari. Non si ottengono conversioni sul piano argomentativo, cioè sul piano della metafisica dimostrativa. Perché? Perché la metafisica scolastica e la teologia scolastica aveva compiuto un'operazione importante rispetto ad Aristotele. Aveva trasformato la metafisica in una ontologia, mentre cioè Aristotele ci dà un'anatomia delle cose che esistono. La metafisica scolastica trasforma questa anatomia in una pluralità di livelli degli esseri fino all'ente infinito increato che è Dio. È questo passaggio che i gesuiti, che i cinesi nella grandissima maggioranza dei casi si rifiutano di compiere e che determina l'insuccesso di tutte le opere di tipo logico e in gran parte di quelle di filosofia naturale e speculativa prodotte dai gesuiti in Cina. Consideriamo che le categorie di Aristotele sono 10, le prime 6 che sono fondamentali sono la sostanza, la qualità, la quantità, la relazione, il luogo e il tempo. Aristotele, cioè, ritiene che il pensiero umano, il linguaggio umano possa vertere su uno di questi 10 tipi di discorso. In realtà è stato sostenuto, un caso classico per esempio la tesi di Émile Benveniste in un articolo celebre del 1958, che Aristotele non fa che sostanzializzare delle categorie delle lingue indoeuropee, cioè trasforma in categoria del pensiero quelle che erano forme sintattico-grammaticali dell'indoeuropeo comune. Questa tesi è stata contrastata, tuttavia è vero che le categorie di Aristotele non trovavano un immediato corrispettivo nella struttura del cinese, ma di tutte le lingue sino-tibetane. La tesi di Benveniste e di altri che lo hanno seguito, un caso interessantissimo per esempio quello di Angus Graham in The Disputers of the Tao, un libro del 1989 in cui si sostiene una tesi analoga, è che non esistendo queste categorie nelle lingue sino-tibetane, non era possibile introdurre a livello ontologico queste concezioni e qualsiasi tentativo di valorarle come verità oggettive non poteva che fallire. Ora, sia vero o non sia vero questo, sta di fatto che questo tipo di scritti non penetra, non agisce. Non dico che non abbia lettori, ebbe lettori, ma ebbe più ripulse che lettori. Un altro elemento di grossa difficoltà di carattere linguistico, e qui veniamo all'ispirazione latina di questo convegno, è il problema elementare della traduzione, prescindendo dalle categorie profonde del linguaggio, a livello di lessico. Dobbiamo tenere presente che la tradizione greca ci presenta due corpi disciplinari diversi nell'ambito della matematica. La geometria greca è nettamente distinta dall'aritmetica greca. La geometria di Euclide è una geometria senza numeri. Paragona linee, paragona aree, ma nelle loro caratteristiche formali, grafiche, non dal punto di vista delle quantità. Dimostra l'uguaglianza di due triangoli ragionando sulle loro caratteristiche strutturali, non sulla misurazione dei loro lati. Quindi questa purezza, questo purismo geometrico era estraneo alla tradizione matematica cinese, che era di carattere, è stato detto, più utilitaristico, cioè in sostanza dimostrava proprietà di figure attraverso misure operate su queste figure. E mancava, soprattutto nella tradizione sia cinese che indiana, un aspetto che è l'aspetto fondamentale, distintivo, la grandissima scoperta dello spirito matematico greco, che è l'aspetto assiomatico deduttivo. Gli elementi di Euclide, come sapete, esordiscono con definizioni, poi ci presentano postulati, poi ci presentano assiomi e solo dopo ci presentano proposizioni. Quindi il lessico euclideo non consiste solo di nomi di enti matematici o nomi di operazioni su questi enti, ma consiste di nomi di regole preliminari rispetto all'esecuzione dei teoremi o dei problemi. Per esempio assioma, che non è una parola matematica. Postulato non è una proprietà di un ente. Capite? Problema, teorema, lemma non sono oggetti della matematica, sono nozioni del discorso che si fa sugli enti matematici. Quindi appartengono a un linguaggio metamatematico che i cinesi in gran parte non avevano. Quindi tradurre gli elementi di Euclide come qualsiasi opera classica della grecità, della matematica greca, in cinese, molto più che in indiano, essendo il sanscrito una lingua indoeuropea, richiedeva un'infinità di operazioni, tutte in sé intrinsecamente opinabili. Si poteva pensare a una traslitterazione che però introduceva in cinese una parola stranissima di suono incognito e che probabilmente si imbatteva in una ripulsa istintiva da parte del pubblico. Si poteva introdurre una parola cinese di significato analogo con il rischio di fraintendimenti, si poteva introdurre una circonlocuzione o addirittura si poteva coniare un neologismo con particelle cinesi collegate assieme per comunicare un certo significato. Ricci e i suoi successori fanno un po' di tutte queste cose, ma in generale la traslitterazione, uso la parola traslitterazione anche se nel caso del cinese non abbiamo esattamente un passaggio a una lettera, ma penso che ci capiamo ugualmente. In generale la traslitterazione viene progressivamente abbandonata perché non efficace. Giulio Aleni, per esempio, ci dà una parola cinese per filosofia che è filosofia o qualcosa del genere. Ci dà una parola simile per logica, ci dà una parola simile per dialettica, ma queste parole non penetrano, non trovano orecchie pronte. Quindi la traduzione era un problema delicatissimo già a livello di semplice lessico. Ricci era consapevole di questo e nella sua traduzione degli elementi, che è la pietra angolare di tutta l'opera matematica dei Gesuiti in Cina, si limita ai primi 6 libri che escludono quelli più complessi, quelli di applicazione della teoria delle proporzioni e quelli relativi alla geometria solida, e in questi 6 libri opera delle semplificazioni per cercare di superare questo tipo di difficoltà. Nello sviluppo delle missioni in Cina e soprattutto nello sviluppo di quella di Pechino, abbiamo ovviamente delle rimarcazioni. Teniamo presente che il 600 è l'epoca della rivoluzione scientifica, quindi alle spalle dei missionari è in atto un terremoto. I missionari non possono introdurre il terremoto, in parte perché si sono formati in un terreno ancora solido, non sismico, cioè nella didattica delle loro scuole, ma in parte anche perché non possono introdurre problemi ma conoscenze. Quindi abbiamo uno sviluppo molto cauto. Questo riguarda per esempio la questione del copernicanesimo. I gesuiti sono stati accusati moltissime volte di aver contribuito a una staticità della situazione scientifica cinese non insegnando l'eliocentrismo. C'è da chiedersi come avrebbero reagito i cinesi di fronte a una dottrina portata da estranei che già creava dei dubbi in generale, se avesse presentato un elemento così dirompente come quello di un cambiamento del punto di vista complessivo. Ma a parte questo, abbiamo un passaggio decisivo all'arrivo della missione gesuitica francese. In precedenza, tutti i missionari gesuiti in Cina fanno capo alla provincia goana, che era un'articolazione dell'assistenza lusitana della compagnia, cioè dell'assistenza portoghese. Quando anche venissero da altre zone d'Europa, erano interni alla provincia goana, cioè erano allineati nel quadro operativo dell'assistenza di Portogallo. I francesi arrivano alla fine degli anni '80 a Pechino, portando una cultura scientifica enormemente avanzata. Dietro di loro c'è Descartes, c'è Fermat, c'è l'atomismo avanzante, c'è la trigonometria evoluta, c'è l'inizio dell'analisi matematica, che nel caso dei precedenti missionari portoghesi non c'erano. Quindi si crea un salto, le cui conseguenze diventano evidenti nel Settecento, e questo produce un mutamento anche nel ruolo internazionale dei missionari, nel senso che nella fase precedente i missionari dell'assistenza di Portogallo fanno essenzialmente i didatti della scienza verso i cinesi. Nel Settecento persiste questo scopo, ma nello stesso tempo i missionari diventano improprio ricercatori scientifici in dialogo con le sedi europee, cioè con le accademie. E quindi l'osservatorio francese di Pechino diventa un terminale dell'Académie des Sciences, ma anche dell'Accademia di Pietroburgo e anche dell'Accademia Naturae Curiosorum tedesca e così via. Quindi a poco si crea un tessuto connettivo in cui le notizie dalla Cina sono notizie che entrano nella enciclopedia scientifica complessiva. Concludendo, ci sarebbero moltissime cose da dire, come potete immaginare, ma io ho sempre visto l'operazione dei gesuiti in Cina come un fatto drammatico. È un fatto drammatico perché i più intelligenti, i più colti di loro sanno che la sintesi che propongono sta avvenendo erosa alle loro spalle in Europa. E molti di loro hanno dei dubbi su quella sintesi, ma non possono dissociarsene nel mentre la diffondono. Nello stesso tempo sono costretti a muoversi su un terreno estremamente difficile di compenetrazioni di concezioni europee e cinesi. L'esempio simbolico di questo sono gli strumenti di Ferbist sul tetto dell'osservatorio di Pechino. Voi avete delle opere d'arte in bronzo cinesi con gradazioni europee. Cioè abbiamo il tentativo di rendere palatabili i contenuti attraverso le forme. E questo è un tentativo che costa estrema fatica e che logora molti di questi uomini. La storia personale di molte di queste persone è una storia di sofferenza, il che viene spesso ignorato perché noi li guardiamo come figure pubbliche. In realtà c'è una storia interna dei singoli e delle comunità che è estremamente complicata. Tutto questo finirà con il collasso della compagnia. Ma attenzione, e finisco veramente, la fine della compagnia, cacciata dal Portogallo da Pombal nel 1758-59 e espulsa dagli stati borbonici negli anni 60, abrogata da Clemente XIII del 1773, la fine della compagnia non significa la fine fisica dei missionari, perché i missionari che risiedevano nei territori politicamente appartenenti a questi stati che ho nominato debbono tornare in Europa. Pombal fa razziare tutti i missionari di tutte le colonie portoghesi e li riporta in Europa e finiscono tutti in Italia. Nel caso invece dei missionari che operavano all'interno di stati stranieri, per esempio nel caso della Cina, ma anche nel caso dell'India, questo non avviene. La gran parte di questi uomini restano fino alla morte fisica. L'ultimo gesuita portoghese a Pechino muore nel 1805, ancora come astronomo dell'Osservatorio Imperiale di Pechino. Quindi occorre anche questo distinguere la storia istituzionale e la storia personale. Mi fermo qui, grazie.
Penso che la
discussione è alla fine.
Allora, grazie al professor Baldini. And we welcome Sven Günther from the Northeast Norman University. And his talk, the title of his talk is Western Antiquity in Maffei, Historiae Indiche, Book 6, China.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you all will receive a handout. I do not have a PPT, but very traditionally rely on the sources being laid down on paper. And I just wait a few seconds, I think. Okay, it will circulate. Okay. Although I do not come from China at this very moment, since this is barely possible, and only have the very short way coming from the oldest city of Germany, Augusta Treverorum, to here, you may rightly ask why I, being an ancient historian, am invited generously by the organizers of this conference, who take all the pains and costs, of course, to do so, to speak here and not to speak about an ancient history topic, just like the economic relations between the Romans and the supposed Ceres Chinese or the Tini. In fact, I became interested in that topic circa 1 year ago when my wife, my Chinese postdoctoral student, and I organized summer course for talented young school students who were so much motivated not only to study the ancient and modern Silk Roads and the discourses, but also few of them were interested to read something in Latin. And then I remembered that once Christopher Francese had told me that there is a quite undiscovered work and not very much studied work, Giovanni Pietro Maffei's Historiae Indicae in 16 books, having been published the first time in Florence in the year 1588. And in fact, the answer why I am here, Maffei does give already at the end of book 5, that is followed by book 6 about the Chinese, since he says, I want now, because up to now there's not so much known, to talk about the natura, mores, et opes of these Chinese people. You all know that Gianno Pietro Maffei was an Italian Jesuit living from 1500 to 1603. But you may wonder why he uses, in fact, a very ancient geographical, ethnographical framework to describe what he will present in Book 6, which is really outstanding in his old 16 volumes work, since it's the only, let's say, more systematic account of a people that is made extant there, because the rest of these 16 volumes deal mainly with the history of the Portuguese voyages, conquests, and economic as well as missionary contacts to India, China, Japan, and the like. So I have a very small, or I went to this text with a very small question: to what extent can we discover Western antiquity in the work on Book 6 of Maffei's Historiae Indicae, and what kind of function does this have throughout Book 6, but probably also extending to the whole work. A very few words on Gianni Maffei, born in Bergamo, and having been very much influenced by his two uncles. So Basilio Zanchi on the one hand, being a poet, but later also leading the Vatican Library under Pope Paul IV, and the other uncle, John Chrysostom Zanchi, being an historian and linguist with very much and deep knowledge of antiquity. And so you see already that a profound basis had been laid down to deal with classics, but also with historical issues. While he became later on professor for rhetorics in Genoa, and then in the 1565 a Jesuit, then moving also to the Collegium Romanum as a rhetoric professor in Rome. He was invited, after having published the very early history of the Portuguese voyages in Latin, by the then prince, later king of Portugal, King Henry, then to study the archives and to write down, as I already told you, the history of the Indies, which is really much a historical narrative, so to say, a work that was finished after Henry had died under the then Spanish and Portuguese king Philip II. Throughout the work, he criticizes, in fact, very much the Portuguese behavior, not only towards or against the Chinese, but towards all the different people that were contacted throughout the journeys. And he very much worries whether the Christian faith can be spread in all these regions. This said, I come now to the handout, which hopefully you now all have in hand. And I want shortly to go through the passages that somehow deal with antiquity. It already starts with the beginning of this account, this geographical ethnographic account. So on page 91b, where you can see a very typical beginning describing the geographical setting, and while the, let's say, southern part is described rather accurately, the northern part is still filled with topoi, since the Skytai and the Massagetai are mentioned, something that we can trace back already to the early imperial times, so in the geography of Strabo, but also the passage from the Claudian geographer Pomponius Mela, which I have printed you on the handout. Anyway, he describes that China had expanded before that time quite far more distant, and then that there was a decline in power and in military force, so that they went back into their original place of settlement. And he compares this with the Carthaginians. This is in the third last line of Gianno Pietro Maffei's start on page 91b. And this is now very interesting, since this cannot be found as a direct quote somehow in ancient writers. Of course, we find, for instance, in Cicero's Res Publica, in the second book, the mention that the Greek cities, but also the Carthaginian cities, being situated directly at the coast or at with direct access to the sea, morally decline very easily, but that's not exactly fitting somehow to this passage. And also, of course, you all know the famous description of Hannibal being conquered in Campania due to the luxury, and then losing, in fact, his campaign eventually. However, for us nowadays, it reminds much more of that famous narrative, starting with Sallust, Cicero, and the like, that Rome's decline started after Carthage had been defeated. So a quite interesting interpretation already of this passage. This rather more clear reference is followed by another reference that talks about the moschus animal, which Maffei, on the second page of your handout, claims that it doesn't appear really in Greek and Latin authors. As you see from the quotation from the Thesaurus Linguae Latinae, that's not true. Yes, we find few references in late Latin authors, but in these classical authors, probably read by Gianno Pietro Maffei, this wasn't mentioned quite clearly. Another passage that is interesting is then the description of the layout of the Chinese cities and the houses of the elite, the rich villas, which reminds very much of very traditional setup of a Roman military camp or a planned Roman city. And if you read the full description of the private houses, you will be also reminded that he in fact applies all these vocabularies with atrium and so on, being used for the description of the Chinese villas. If you go to the third page of your handout, you will see that this applies also to the notion of the very well set up ways and streets of the Chinese that are compared with the Roman streets and said to be not inferior to these Roman ways. So the infrastructural argument is also compared with the Romans, and I think that's a clear reference to the ancient times, not to his own times, probably. While in these last two passages, we again have quite a clear connection to antiquity that is explicitly made. The following passage on the marriages and the status of women is rather different. So there is, of course, no comparison being made, but in fact, there is an indirect comparison, since it's about the dowry, which is not traditionally given by the woman to the man, but he says the man has to provide the dowry in the Chinese custom to the woman, while the further description about prostitutes and so reminds us clearly of the hierarchical status of women we find not only in Roman times. Quite a long passage he devotes to the scripture of the Chinese, which is a topic on itself and could be expanded and compared with writings from Athanasius Kircher and so on very much. I only want to point out that on page 95a, he compares the writing with the Greek writing, but also with the Hebrew writing, and in the end and eventually he also mentions the Egyptian hieroglyphs. A very interesting point in this regard is that at the end of the first paragraph, he compares again the Chinese standardized language with Latin. So in the third last line of that paragraph, he says, Latinae apud nos linguae respondet. So if you read the sentence before, so Latin is the sermo or eruditorum, and for the Chinese it is this standardized language being used throughout the Chinese realm. Of course, Maffei does not only talk about the customs, but also about the economic behavior. And he interestingly also compares the money of the Chinese with the Western money, ancient Western money. So he looks at these bullion money in silver being used for measuring the prices, which is also cut into pieces according to the weight that is needed. And he compares it with the one bullion money once having been used in Latium. Furthermore, he then mentions the famous coinage of the Chinese bronze coinage that is with a hole in the middle to line it up and to carry it. To get a kind of impression what he could have meant at this time, please go to the next page of your handout. So you see at around that time, the Ming Dynasty, this silver bullion money was quite common in the south of China to pay the taxes, and it was also thought consciously by the Chinese to do so to get the silver run into the imperial treasure, while the so-called cash coins with the hole in the middle were thought for smaller transactions. That what also Maffei indicates in his account. The Latium coinage, probably the best example is I signatum, an example of which you can see as a third coinage, but we could also compare it with Eis Rude, for instance, which was cut similar to hack silver or so into the pieces and weight needed for the economic transaction. On the 7th page of your handout, then he goes on with looking in a bit more carefully at the imperial household. That's a very long passage. I can't go into too many details. Also, I cannot describe the hierarchical bureaucracy and the exam system here, but in describing the amount of money in the treasure of the Chinese emperor, he uses again a very interesting comparison to the Emperor Vespasianus while dying, having left behind quite similar amount than the 20 million he ascribes to the Chinese emperor, and he furthermore mentions that they also deal especially with foreign money. There's a small typo, by the way. It's not to be read in the second line, decentius, but ducentius. But that shall not disturb us too much. In fact, this number cannot be found in any ancient account. And I actually don't know where he has this number from. No? So this number of 20 million or so being left behind. If anyone has an idea, I also looked up the economic survey of Rome and so. The closest parallel is certainly Suetonius' Vita Vespasiani, where he describes the thrifty behavior of Vespasian, but also that he raised more taxes and tried to get more revenues into the Roman treasury, since at the end of the civil wars after the death of Nero and the ascendance of Vespasian to the throne, it was barely empty, so to say. And you can compare this also with Cassius Dio. Of course, not only economic, infrastructural, and other behaviors of the Chinese are described, but also, but not too much is written about the religious behavior. We have already heard in the Siena conference something about that. So he mentions the Apostle Thomas, of course, but he says that there are few traces, in fact, of this work of Thomas anymore. So he just describes an image of a woman taking care of a small child, but the Chinese wouldn't really know what is the background of this. And he describes it overall that nothing of the Christian faith that had once been brought to by Apostle Thomas can be found anymore there. However, we must remember this is before the Nestorian stelae is discovered, and later on, the Jesuits built this succession so that the Jesuits, in fact, introduced the faith, the Christian faith, to China the third time after Thomas, and the Nestorians are made Orthodox Christians, in fact, by this move. In that passage also he talks a bit about the Pythagorean thought that can be found among the Chinese. So also further references to antiquity are made here. This also applies, though in an indirect way, in the second last passage on the 7th page, where you can see that it's about the way of sacrificing, doing a religious ritual. In the Siena conference, we also heard something about that. And for instance, the libation and so are described very vividly. So, in fact, basis is made so that somehow Christian faith could enter China. Second last passage then deals with the fingernails and of the Chinese, so the one that is left long, to show that the rich Chinese at least don't have to work and can enjoy some leisure time, which is compared to the Greeks, and also the Greeks wearing the sandals, the carapidae, and having long hair, in fact. That's now also a very interesting case, since if you go to the next page, you will find this long hair of the Greeks being something that doesn't refer to classical times. It's a more archaic way to wear the hair. And for instance, the Spartans are still said in classical times to have the hair long. And if you search for the Crepidae, you will find that it's not very much clear how he wants to build here a kind of connection, since Crepidae were, let's say, the signature shoe of the Greeks and nothing special for the elite. In Theophrast characters, for instance, you can find that cutting the hair and also cutting the fingernails was very common, and was also a sign that you could take care of your body. Coming to the last passage, we see that the king is, or the emperor, sorry, is described as having a very serious behavior and acting, in fact, like the bad Roman emperors, here in comparison to the emperor Gaius Caligula, and related here to the institution of the prostitute tax, which you can also find again being mentioned in the respective vita by Suetonius. So if we go through all these passages, we may ask ourselves, what's the exact function of that, and how does it fit to the overall description? That's in fact part of my conclusion. At the end of Book 6, Gianno Pietro Maffei describes or says that eventually, due to all the bad behavior of the Portuguese landing in 1517 at the Chinese coast, and then really acting somehow outrageously, there is no ground anymore for Christian faith to be settled there. So he, in fact, is rather disappointed about how this introduction or reintroduction of Christian faith was linked to the conquest and the economic pressure put on by the Portuguese. Reading not only Book 6, one gets the impression that he describes the bad moral state of the Portuguese and builds up a kind of utopia that China is far distant, but with all the very good and perfect setup in terms of infrastructure, in terms of customs, in terms of richnesses, goods that can be acquired there, a topic which I had to leave out in this talk. The two difficulties are, on the one hand, religion, which is described as being inanis, so really a superstition that must be taken care of from the viewpoint of a Christian missionary, but also the emperor is described as being not rational, really being an absolute emperor that can behave very badly. In fact, I think the audience of that messages was not so much the Chinese, of course, but the Portuguese emperor and the Portuguese elite that should also see the potential of this utopia, but also that there are these moral vices that have to be fought against, not in China, but in Portugal and in Italy, so the places where Gianno Pietro Maffei wrote and published his work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Günther. And we add toward our last presentation for this first part of the session. We welcome Kim Ki-hoon, hope I said it right, Seoul National University, and his paper will be about the reception of Matteo Ricci's on friendship in East Asia.
Do you receive the papers? Okay, thank you. Many thanks for invitation to co-organization of this conference. This paper, maybe you have in hand. This paper is a provision of small conclusion from reading and study of Matteo Ricci's Zhao and Martino Martini's Sino-European as a part of the research project, the reception of Aristotle's philosophy in East Asia, in Korea since 2019. The director of the team is Professor Jae-won over there. Yes, let's start. Matteo Ricci's Zhao is well-known work as an early example of Jesuit accommodation in late Ming China. Filled with maxims of precepts on friendship, Zhao seems to have influenced on Confucian literati since the end of 16th century in East Asia. It introduced the Western thought on social relationships into China as well as Korea, where the Christianity and Shishui already permitted. Researches on the reception of Zhao have showed that this work is deeply impressive to the intellectuals in Joseon Dynasty in Korea since 17th century, particularly or realist or pragmatic school of Confucianism, so-called Chilha in Korean, maybe Chinese pronunciation, Shurchui. As a result, the sentences or maxims like a friend is another self, a friend is a half of me, sound hardly philosophical but familiar to modern Koreans without reminding the names of Aristotle, Cicero, or Matteo Ricci. Some ideas of the friendship of or from Western civilization has become a part of tradition or has been moderately adjusted since the era of interchanging between Eastern and Western, so that it would be difficult to distinguish absolutely which friendship discourse is proper to East Asian culture or which ideas came from Western learning. But the detailed study on such a reception history shall provide some clues to identify specific acts. Matteo Ricci's Zhao could be one of the significant cases. In short, the publishing of Zhao has three phases. First, Matteo Ricci's own manuscript or draft as the answer Prince Jiannan Wang in Nanchang. Second, the official publication in Beijing. Finally, the incorporated version into the Tianxue Chuhan by Luigi Zhao. However, Tianxue Chuhan edition, among others, has unusually attracted one-sided attention to the researchers of Koreanology or Korean studies on Shishui, Western learning. In this preliminary paper, the textual significance of Zhao, which has been relatively neglected, is to be examined briefly by comparing its title, publication forms of the codices and editions. First, Codex BL. It is the first draft as the response to Prince Jinan in Nanchang, 1595. It must have been copied within the Society of Chinese Acquaintances till the end of the century, as Matteo Ricci's letter to Girolamo Costa in the 15th August 1599, alludes. It contains 76 sentences or maxims with a short introduction of Matteo-Ricci and with a brief epilogue as colophon. So this version of Jae-Lun is edited by modern publishing as having 78 sentence numbers. Most of all, the Codex BL has a handwritten Italian translation of Matteo-Ricci, which had been missing for a long time, but was discovered in the British Library some decades ago. The manuscript might be enveloped within the letter to Giovanni Costa. Second Codex BNC. It is the official published edition in Beijing, including the preface Feng. It seems to have been published in early days without the permission of Matteo-Ricci, but the publication soon had approval of the Jesuit with a stamp on the end of the book. Before the publishing, Matteo-Ricci supplemented the first draft Jae-Lun, that is the Codex BL, and so this edition has totally 100 sentences, so 24 sentences added by the author himself, with an introduction and an epilogue. Another cover size, BAV and BNF, seem to be almost identical to BNC in terms of Chinese text, with a little printing error. Third codex or edition is the unincorporated edition in the Tianxue Chuhan. Li Jizhao edited and published the works of FISR as a single collection under the title Tianxue Chuhan. English translation may be First Collection of the Learning from Heaven. Jae-Lun also became a part of it 19 years after the death of Matteo-Ricci, including the prefaces by Feng Yingqing and Qu Taisu. The form of the work was not changed, but the text itself seemed to be partly amended by Li Jizhao. Interestingly, because of the accessibility Tianxue Chuhan, the most posterity could read Jae-Lun by this edition. And likewise, the Tianxue Chuhan has unusual authority on the study of Xixue. In any case, it has primarily provided an opportunity to read Jae-Lun to Korean intellectuals ever since the 17th century. The differences on the title of the work and the publication form between the main codices mentioned above are as following. You can see the table. Title and heading, sentence number, and Italian edition contained or not. First of all, the codices BL and BNC preserve the expression Da, Jin and Wang, but the Tianxue Chuhan edition has not any clue for it. Although the readers are soon to acknowledge the motive and the purpose of the work and author by reading the introduction of Jae-Lun. The title and the heading written by Matteo-Ricci should be retained as in the original codices. Next, only the Tianxue Chuhan edition has an additional character, Jiao, in the title. That the Jae-Lun is now generally known to readers. Original title Jae-Lun might be changed into such a shape by the reception in China. The reason why is the problem to solve by detailed studying works. Above all, it is important that there are some changes in the text added or slightly revised by the author himself. So strictly speaking, the Codex BNC is a kind of criterion of Jae-Lun that one could edit the text with apparatus criticus. Therefore, the critical edition on the textual history of Jae-Lun will be able to distinguish, respectively, the strata of its authority and authenticity. First is stratum, Matteo-Ricci's, as it were, Inventio Prima Rocorum de Antiquità, 1595. What to do is comparison of the Codex BL's Chinese text and the Italian edition of the author himself. and then review of original 76 sentences. Second stratum, material which is afterthought on the first draft and the supplement for publishing, maybe 1601. Analysis of 24 added sentences and comparison of the revised Chinese text by the author himself with the Codex BL's text. Third stratum is Li Zhijiao's slight revision, 1629, after Matthew Rich's thesis. The work to do is comparison of the text with the Codex BNC and the review of the change of the title and heading of the work. In the future, a critical edition of Jiayou in Korea shall be significant for the researcher because it will be able to provide a text that is nearer to the original idea and proposal of Matthew Rich, the author himself. And by collatio and vacantio of the codices and the editions, one could recover the forgotten or neglected history of Jiayou. Recently in Korea, several Koreanologists have brought out academical works on the Jiayou, but most of them are focused on the reception history in the Joseon dynasty. For example, there are notice-level articles written in Korean as follows. Out of these examples, only Bazurian's 2016 and Noyontail's 2017 mentioned all the codices, but they did not treat the problem in detail. Cautiously speaking, several scholars are still studying Jiayou based on the Tianxue Chuhan. Even the Korean translations also have the original text from the Tianxue Chuhan, like this. Two translations in Korean. However, one should estimate the history of studying Jiayou on two academical groundworks in Italy. First one, Pasquale Maria Delias. Second one is of Professor Filippo Minini's this book. And the Professor Minini is there. Thank you. Delia's monumental work is newly focused on the source of Jiayou and did excavate the flowers of Matthew Rich's memory, the antichità. So many sentences written by Matthew Rich from his memory in Jiayou are now considered as borrowed from a digest or commonplace book. Sententia exemplar, blah, 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 blah. The author of this source book is Andrea de Rasente or Andreas Everensis. And this book seems to have been so popular in his day. As Delia shows, Matthew Rich's most ideas and precepts might be taken out from Andreas Everensis' work, and the latter had also comprehended various topics, maxims from the ancient classical authors. So now readers could enjoy and reflect the original thought on friendship of Aristotle, Cicero, and Plutarch, etc. by reading Jiayou. However, Delia might have not got Matthew Rich's original translation manuscript. Since 19th century, the letter had been considered as his handwriting one, till the Codex BL appeared again in Light of the World, as mentioned above. For a long time, this forged epigraph was thought as the author's, but this letter is corrected to one of the autograph in the Codex BL in order to translate the text into more native Italian and to remove the awkwardness due to Chinese language. So this one is most far from the original idea on friendship. That is, first ancient authors, then Andreas Everensis, and then the Chinese text of the BL, and then Matthew Rich's Italian translation of the BL, and the final anonymous correction of Rich's translation. Professor Minini's edition is the most comprehensive and wonderful achievement of studying Jiayou. He translated the Codex BNC into Italian and edited Matthew Rich's BL translation and its autograph. In addition, Sophia Mattei In this edition, provided enormous source study, including address references. So now, Milanese edition has often been referred to as a standard. Nevertheless, nor it does digitalize the Chinese text, nor contain an apparatus criticus for the text itself. Therefore, it is not, strictly speaking, not critical edition, but it is still functioning as a foundation for follow-up studies of Jiayulun. The first full English translation of Timothy Billings is based on the textual examination as discussed in this paper. His bilingual edition has a kind of appendix critique instead of apparatus criticus. Billings edited the text based on the Codex BNC, with mainly comparing the BL and the Tianjue edition. For a decade, his work has been a stepping stone to readers and researchers of matter rich. My paper also has passed over it to put a next small stone over a border of studying Jiayulun. In conclusion, it is time to prepare a renewed Jiayulun edition, at least in the field of Koreanology or Korean studies on the FISR. After the rediscovery of the Codex BL, as discussed above, the story or the history to be written changed. The critical edition of Jiayulun, which could be available by close cross-reading and diligent recension, will be necessary not only to review the reception and influence of matter rich, but also to identify if there are subtle misreadings or misunderstandings for centuries in reading Jiayulun. I would like to introduce a footnote, number 5, a curious example in Korea. A kind of neo-Confucianistic athletic movement, so-called Dongha in Korean, maybe Chinese is like pronunciation, Dongshui, arose as a reaction to the Christianity and the FISR in the end of the 19th century. Interestingly, the devotees of Jingsan-do, Jingsan means its religion's founders' cognomen, nickname. So Jingsan-do means the religion, Jingsanism. One of the newly rising religions which have been derived from Dongha, Dongshui, are rather honoring matter rich as Daesangsa, Da Shang Shi, great divine master of their precepts. Maybe his Tianjue Shi has significantly influenced on it. And returning to my paper, moreover, its standard form, bilingual edition with apparatus criticus and apparatus pontium or apparatus similium, seems to be better and more applied to readers and researchers for understanding a complicated history of the text Jiayulun. Then, although it would take some time, once again, the history or story should be changed due to Korea, a kind of borderland nation among civilizations. Thank you for attention.
And now we are a little bit in advance, and we can move to the coffee break at the Caffè dei Cavalieri. So we will lead you anyway. And we will be back in 15 minutes, or maybe a bit more, since we are 20-25 minutes. but full of energies at least. Passo all'italiano, visto che i prossimi relatori sono tutti nostri connazionali. Allora, la prima relatrice di questa seconda parte di questa giornata è Luisa Maria Paternò. No, anzi mi sbaglio, scusate, confusione nell'ordine nella scaletta. Quindi no, si tratta di Biagio Santorelli, professore associato all'Università di Genova, che ci parlerà terrà il suo intervento sarà su tradurre la scienza cinese, la China illustrata, giusto? Di Athanasius Kircher.
Grazie. Parlerò in inglese, spero che sia più comprensibile, che non sia troppo incomprensibile, appunto. And I will start by a confession. I will start by confessing that I'm an intruder. I am by no means an expert in the history of science. I'm here because in 2015 I had the chance to translate one of the earliest modern works that sparked interest in China and Chinese culture in Europe across the 17th century. I'm referring to the China Illustrata by Father Athanasius Kircher. And so in my presentation today, I will give a quick overview of the cultural value of this work, and especially regarding its contribution to the knowledge of China and Chinese culture in Europe. And then I will offer some insight on the overall interpretation that Kircher offers of the connections between Chinese and more broadly Eastern culture and the European correspondent. I'm sure that most of you are already well acquainted with this polymath, and after all, a whole conference about Kircher would not be enough to give a proper introduction to the relevance of the works of this man of misconceptions, as he was kindly labeled in the title of a biography published 10 years ago by John Glassy. So I will refrain from giving you a full account of the life and works of Kircher. Suffice it to say to remember that between the year 1631, when he published his first book on magnetism, and the year 1680, when he died at the age of 78, he had published almost 40 books on virtually any aspect of human knowledge that was fashionable at his time. And his research and writing interests included magnetism, acoustics, optics, and then geology, volcanism, and then alchemy, ancient languages, Egyptology, finally sinology, and of course theology. He claimed to be the inventor of a large number of automatons which he could display in Rome, and over 3 decades he collected countless wonders in his Museum Kircherianum at the Roman College. For his erudition, basically in every field of human knowledge, he was known and, let's say, respected in his lifetime, to be fair, for most of his lifetime. In fact, what is more striking about Kircher, his figure and his work, is that while he was still approaching science and knowledge, basically from the standpoint of a humanist, the world around him was changing quite quickly, and as his biographer, so to say, Glassy, states, when Kircher was born, to pick the easiest example, almost everyone assumed the earth was at the center of the universe. At the time of his death, almost every educated man willing to be honest with himself understood that it wasn't. So we have been hearing about the earthquake that was shaking the life and the activity of Jesuits in that time. Let's say that Kircher was not that shaken from that earthquake. By the end of his life, actually the scientific value and reliability of his books, at least most of them, had already begun to be questioned and reconsidered. Most of his assumptions had already been disproven, and others will be subsequently. Yet, as a revival of interest in scholarship has shown over the last recent decades, Kircher's book made a valuable contribution to the culture of his times. They may be generally not grounded on what we would call a scientific method. They may be at least partially wrong in their conclusions, yet Kircher's work circulated widely throughout the Western world during his lifetime. And they aroused the interest of younger scholars, younger scientists, who would then approach those very topics that he had brought to the general attention from a different perspective. Now let us approach the China Illustrata. This work was published in 1667, and it was met with great interest throughout Europe, as it was confirmed by 3 translations in Dutch, then French, and English that followed the original Latin edition within a few years. The publication of this work fostered Sinophilism across Europe and laid the foundations for the vocabulary of sinology, both in Latin and in the modern languages in which it was translated. As for Kircher, he himself was regarded as, from that moment on, as one of the major experts about China and Chinese culture, although he never visited the country, nor he had any first-hand knowledge about Chinese culture. Now, the sources for Kircher's work are the reports, the letter, the artworks, the materials that the Jesuits engaged in missions in China and more generally in Eastern Asia had been sending to Rome over the previous decades, ever since the establishment of Matteo Ricci's mission in China. In his Proemium ad lectorem, Kircher states that he had been collecting materials about China over a decade prior to the publication of his work, both drawing on written materials and on conversations with the missionaries who in those years had returned from China and had visited Rome. The reader is given a list of the missionaries that, with their works and the conversation they had in Rome, provided him with the material that we will find compiled in his book. It's a list of characters that we will be hearing a lot about over the next days of conferences. First, Kircher remembers Martino Martini, who had been a student of him and then had been a missionary in China. He had also published, as you know, an Atlas Sinensis, which had shared the cartographical knowledge that he had earned in his travels. Kircher mentions then the Paul Father Michael Boym, who had been sent by the last Ming emperor as an ambassador to Rome. He had been forced to travel by land, and so he had collected a wealth of observations about China, but in general about Central Asia. And he shared this information with Kircher in Rome. In Rome, Kircher had also met the Genoese father Filippo Marino, who was the procurator of Japan, who also discussed with Kircher and actually had also published a book on the Jesuit missions in China, Japan, and Tonkin. Kircher would also rely on the information he received by the Austrian father Johann Gruber, who was too a missionary in China, who was sent back to Rome and had to travel, since it was impossible for him to travel by sea, was forced to find a new path overland from Beijing to India. In India, was joined by another Jesuit father, Heinrich Roth, and together they had to cross basically the whole Asia back to Rome, across the Persian Empire and Turkey, and the Mughal Empire, of course. When they arrived in Rome, it was year 1664. In that very year, Kircher was in the final stages of writing the China Illustrata. In that very year, the manuscript was submitted for the imprimatur and then was finalized a couple of years later. Now, the nature and the breadth of these sources that Kircher lists should be taken into account when we consider, when we assess the structure, the very essence of the China Illustrata. The reader in this book is presented with a compilation of miscellaneous materials which vary both in scope and reliability. Kircher published for the first time a wealth of information on letter reports from the Jesuit missionaries and even by some of the Eastern rulers who had been in contact with the Jesuit missions. And he also gives the earliest detailed accounts of the itineraries from Europe to China and back, which were carried out by the Jesuits. And he enriches all this material with his own research. He compares, for instance, the most recent travels of the Jesuits with the previous reports travels to the Far East, most notably the one by Marco Polo. And he also exploits all this knowledge to offer the reader fairly accurate maps with sketches and outlines of the routes that were available to China and back. Most of his documentation was a novelty for the European audience, and from this point of view, the China Illustrata was a seminal work of dissemination. And to make it even more captivating and also artistically bearable, Kircher encloses a good deal of illustration, which were probably made by a group of Dutch artists, which included portraits of the Jesuits, which he mentioned in his book, miraculous objects of Christian worship, which were found in India or in China. Now, we know some of these artifacts from other sources, but basically they were almost unknown to his readership at the time of publication of the China Illustrata. He portrays several objects of cult in the religio, both of India and China, then illustrations of clothes, costumes typical of the ethnic groups living in the Cynic Empire or in its vicinity. And he also adds marvelous descriptions of the ruler, the prodigies of local flora. That, for instance, is a representation of the tea tree, which tree was able to announce to his readership a couple of years before tea was actually available on the European market. And then he goes on with prodigies of the local fauna, the natural or supposed natural landscape, and human architecture. So this is just a very quick survey of what we find, a few examples of what we find in the China Illustrata. But from these few cases only, we can get an idea of the impression that this book made on his European readership, on the imagination of the European readership in 1667, both in terms of knowledge of the works that the Jesuits were doing in that very distant and mostly unknown land, at least to most of his readership, and also in terms of fascination for this exotic world. Now, due to the nature of the material, the sources that Kircher had available, and also keeping into account the Kircher's obvious passion for telling stories, especially wonderful stories, the scope of the China Illustrata, despite the title, is not restricted to China only. Kircher gives as much information he can about Japan, India, basically any place in Asia that was touched upon by the Jesuits or even just mentioned in their material. However, if we approach this wealth of material that is collected in this book from a, let's say, skeptical standpoint, we realize quite easily that not all the information that Kircher relates has the same level of accuracy or even reliability. Kircher does publish documents and accounts for eyewitness testimony of the Jesuits that were directly involved in these travels and discoveries he referred, but he also leaves ample room, generous room to stories about wonders, about nature, the culture, the beliefs of Asian people. Many of them appear not entirely reliable, to say the very least. Sometimes, actually, as we read the China Illustrata, it's difficult to say whether the illustrations are just a supplement to what Kircher is explaining, or actually vice versa, is Kircher who somehow came in possession of these images or could find them in his sources and tried to make some sense of them. Now, regarding the reliability of the stories of Kircher and his own explanations, critics have never been too much kind to our author. Let us just say once again, in the words of John Glassie, that as a general rule, Kircher never ruined a good story with facts. Although well known for more than 30 set cushion-sized books on almost as many subjects, and for an apparent knowledge of almost everything, he was also known for a tendency to embellish on his own behalf. The other frequent complaint against him was more like the opposite. People said he was inclined to believe any spectacular story he heard. Now, let us just take a closer look to some of these stories, especially regarding Chinese scientific knowledge. The China Illustrata is structured in 6 parts. The first one is devoted to the discussion of the discovery and the interpretation of the Nestorian inscription of Xi'an, or Xiganfu, as Kircher and other Jesuits call them. A stele from the 8th century, bearing a text in Chinese and Syriac languages, testifying to an early presence of Christian communities in northern China. This monument was found in 1625 and was, so 40 years later, was not entirely unknown in Europe when Kircher published the China Illustrata. However, Kircher's work is useful as it offers 3 interpretaciones corresponding to the possible ways of working or translating exploited by Ricci and his fellow missionaries that we have been hearing about in the first paper today. So Kircher first offers a romanization of the Chinese and Syriac characters of the text of the whole monument, which has been considered an important step towards the elaboration of a bilingual dictionary Chinese-Latin. Then he offers a literal word-by-word translation into Latin. Finally, he offers a paraphrastic translation, again, into Latin. The second part of this book, of the China Illustrata, is a survey of travels from Europe to China, starting from those of the Apostle, and namely of St. Thomas, which was mentioned by Professor Günther earlier today, up to the most recent journeys by the Jesuits. Then a third part deals with the idolatry that, according to Kircher, was introduced to China, just like the Christian religion had been introduced to China from the West. Several waves of idolatry were introduced from West to China, India, and Japan, basically all over Asia, and they suffocated the seeds of the Christian religion up until the arrival of the Jesuits missionaries. Part 4 is a collection of natural mirabilia of China, and then the subsequent part focuses on the wonders of Chinese architecture. Finally, the last part accounts for Chinese literature, but actually it focuses specifically on the interpretation of Chinese ideograms and their evolution. Overall, we can say that Kircher's perspective on Chinese technical and scientific knowledge generally implies a comparison with the corresponding skills of the Europeans. Kircher refers a large variety of anecdotes, which most of which feature a recurring narrative pattern. Usually, there is a comparison that takes place at the court of a ruler or at least of a high dignitary. The comparison between the Eastern and Western knowledge and skills is prompted by some accident, some problem that local experts in the relevant field are not able to solve until an European expert, usually a Jesuit missionary, solves this difficulty so as to earn the ruler's respect both for himself and for the entire tradition of knowledge he represents. And finally, all this paves the way for the appreciation also of the Christian religion. Episodes featuring this pattern are said to have occurred basically everywhere around along the route between Rome and China. That's, for instance, the case of a doctor who, when was crossing the kingdom of the great Mughal, was the only one able to cure the king's favorite tame elephant, as he was able to uproot with his bare hands a sugar cane that had taken root in the elephant's stomach. And ample proof of this pattern is offered by the stories of Matteo Ricci and Adam Schall, with the revision of the traditional Chinese cartography, astronomy, the conception of the calendar. But those will be topics of specific papers tomorrow, so I will not delve into them. In general, we can fairly say that caution is in order when reading the China Illustrata in search for evidence about Chinese knowledge. In general, Kircher exploits anecdotes about the encounter between Chinese and European knowledge with an apologetic purpose, so as to stress the importance of the missionary activity of the Jesuits in the Far East, so complying with the Dottrina Ricci Professor Baldini mentioned, introduced us today. That's, for instance, just to hear another authoritative voice. 20 years ago, even more, Umberto Eco pointed out, while considering Kircher's overall approach about China, that China, unlike the Americas, was not a remote kingdom to be conquered, or even less to be destroyed, but a prodigal son to be peacefully brought back to the house of father while respecting its original culture and tradition. Now, this approach is quite evident every time that Kircher gives an assessment of Chinese culture. Let's just take a look at an example. In part 4, chapter 3, Kircher is describing the habits of the inhabitants of China. And he gives a very positive judgment of their collective devotion to ethical and political sciences. As for the speculative and applied sciences, Kircher states that the mechanical arts enjoy the greatest consideration among them, while, as he points out a few lines later, the literati don't practice any science other than the political moral one. As for scholastic and speculative matters, they don't even know their names, which is surprising in a nation that boasts so many talented men. Kircher judges positively the traditional training of Chinese doctors, the physicians, and then concludes that if we consider their expertise in liberal arts, architecture, sculpture, and weaving, they are no less than Europeans, except for their sense of proportions and knowledge of optics. However, after this overall positive assessment, the inevitable comparison with the European knowledge arrives, and Kircher states that an excessive, innate pride generally leads the Chinese to despise all foreigners, since they consider themselves superior to any other people in the world in terms of ingenuity and scientific knowledge. This happened up until the moment when our fathers arrived in China. Then, having laid down the peacock's feather, Kircher says, they had to admit that they were so much inferior to the Jesuits, in terms of knowledge and inventiveness, as much as they had boasted of being above all others. And for this reason, Kircher continues, they never ceased to admire our fathers for the novelty and value of the things they had brought with them, considering them geniuses who could not descend from the lineage of men, but must have come down from heaven. This greater appreciation meant that the Christian law could be spread successfully throughout the Sinic kingdom. So this is the pattern that usually Kircher follows when accounting for the information he receives about the Chinese traditional knowledge, the work of the Jesuits, and the outcome of their interaction. There is also another outcome that Kircher is very fond of. He always tries to debunk some false opinions in the Chinese traditional knowledge by exploiting both the research he has been doing on previous sources and specifically his own knowledge in the relevant field. For instance, and sometimes this effort leads him to explanation suggestions that from the perspective of his own readership sometimes was considered not entirely convincing. For instance, in part 4, chapter 11, Kircher is describing the wonders of the mineral kingdom in China. And this prompts Kircher to attempt to debunk the Chinese belief in mineralogy, exploiting his own knowledge in this field, which he had been publishing in previous works. At the very beginning of this chapter, Kircher mentions that on some mountains, after heavy rains, stones appear that are called swallows, rondini, to which they resemble so much that they seem lack only life. Among them, in fact, Chinese doctors can distinguish even male and female based on the diversity of colors, and they use them to make drugs. Assuming this news is trustworthy, I would say that these are not stones shaped by nature in the form of swallows, but quite the opposite, birds, which, while they were still alive and while they were hiding in the crevices of the earth, have been turned into stone by some petrifying effluvium or exhalation. And then he adds a self-quotation for numerous cases of animals, men, quadrupeds, and birds turned into stone, see book 8 of my Mundus Subterraneus. While discussing minerals and Chinese opinions about them, Günther cannot refrain from touching upon the long-standing tradition of wonders about asbestos. The Cynic Atlas, he says, records that in Tanju, a kingdom of Tartary, a grass is born above the stones that fire does not consume. If thrown into flames, this grass turns red and somehow burns. But as soon as it is removed from fire, it recovers its original color, without any part of it having gone to ashes. It doesn't grow much in land, but it has the shape of a capillary. It has a fragile and delicate texture, and when immersed in water, it turns into mud and dissolves instantly. This, Günther says, is the description of the asbestos in which I identify a glaring error. The Cynic consider to be grass, what we believe to be simple stone filament. The fault here lies with the inexperience or ignorance of men who, when they see these inflorescences of stone, believe that some prodigious grass was born from the rock. Then Günther goes on and says that I also have a large amount of this asbestos, also known as amianto, in my museum. Its filaments, when squeezed between the fingers, are absolutely identical to vegetable fibers. If crushed and treated with a certain technique, they produce a paper that can be used to write and then be thrown into the fire. In this way, the ink burns, but the paper remains white and can be reused to write on it again. And once again, a self-quotation, see the 12th book of my Mundus Subterraneus, where I illustrate how or by what arcane artifice these filaments can be produced. That's a great secret which only few know. Günther is quite right in recognizing that the asbestos is closer to a stone filament than to vegetable fibers. This information, however, with the stories about the asbestos cloth or paper being thrown into the fire to clean it, were traditional and were already recorded centuries earlier by Marco Polo, for instance. Günther's correction of the supposed Chinese opinion about this material, it's a progress. Yet, the image of Günther chopping and squeezing and crushing large quantities of asbestos in his museum, seen with today's medical scientific knowledge, makes a certain impression. Actually, in many instances, Günther claims to have received from the missionary returning from China several samples of interesting materials, especially minerals, that allow him to reproduce experiments in order to confirm Jesuit assumptions and debunk wrong scientific opinions of the local expert. And it's often obvious that Günther is basically reenacting information that he could find in his sources. We cannot delve much into this, but the China Illustrata offers a nice collection of anecdotes of this kind. Probably the most famous of them is the anecdote about the snake stones, which were supposedly stones produced by a particular kind of cobra, which, when applied to a snake bit, would adhere to the beaten skin and would absorb all the poison. And then, when put into milk, would release it. Günther, for instance, claims that he had reenacted this experiment several times, but actually he could read it in Michael Boyme Flora Sinensis. There are only the examples that I have touched upon are only few examples of the approach we can expect of Günther's collections of data about China. The search for surprising and even exotic details, the collection of supposed cynic opinions on specific phenomena, which were inevitably overtaken by the skills of the Jesuits, and of course by Günther's knowledge most of all, are a recurring pattern in the China Illustrata. When we read this lengthy book, we can have the impression that China in itself is not the protagonist of the work. With its natural wonders and its 1,000-year-old civilizations, China is enhanced by Günther as a wonderful backdrop for the exploits of the Jesuit missionaries, which are often presented in epic tones. The choice of opening the China Illustrata with the presentation of the Nestorian stele, after all, offers a key to the interpretation of this book. In Kircher's eyes, this artifact is proof that China had received an exposure to the Christian truth. And the seeds of this truth, although were almost suffocated by several waves of idolatry, were still present in Chinese conscience, as it was evidenced by the readiness by which the Chinese and their authorities were open to welcome the Jesuit missionaries and their testimony. After all, this is the purpose for which Kircher publishes the China Illustrata. On one hand, as he says in his farewell to his reader, he aims at enhancing his personal reputation in another field of knowledge by exploiting his own previous publication, in the aim of clarifying and interpreting this new world that the Jesuits had visited, and that he is introducing to the reader. On the other hand, he is working to ensure due recognition of the missionary efforts of the Jesuits, who have been, as he said, crossing far and wide all the immense regions of the ocean and the earth, while being intent on works of greater importance. The strictly scientific contents of Kircher's work will not leave a lasting mark in themselves, yet we can certainly say that dissemination efforts he made with the China Illustrata and his previous works were crowned with great success. The list of the philosophers and scientists who owe Kircher and the China Illustrata part of their inspiration includes, as it's known, Leibniz for his thinking on the binary system, and Jean-François Champollion for his studies on the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which Kircher considered basically the origin for the Chinese ideograms. And this confirms that Kircher's influence often worked in a peculiar way. It worked, and it was effective, in spite of the negative opinions of his readership, and sometimes in spite also of the famous misconception of Kircher himself. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, grazie per il discorso, questa figura molto affascinante. E ora ora ci diamo la parola a Luisa Maria Paternicò, Università di Napoli l'Orientale, e la sua presentazione si intitola Descrivere la grammatica cinese in latino nell'Europa del Settecento.
No, mi sono messa il PowerPoint.
Ah, già solo?
Sì, tranquillo.
Non so se penso sia ancora
Faccio...
sia condiviso, vero?
Ah, deve essere condiviso.
No, dico sulla piattaforma Teams, ma penso che valga, perché io l'avevo già condiviso, quindi vale se ancora là.
Non è il PDF, è il PowerPoint, ho messo un altro file.
Non so se prende
Chiediamo.
Sì.
Chi segue online vede il file.
Vedono lo schermo loro?
Forse no.
No,
sì, però è condiviso lo schermo.
Condiviso lo schermo?
Sì, è già condiviso.
Sì, dovrebbe essere a posto, basta passare in modalità schermo pieno.
Ok. Grazie. Però io non vedo. Ok, mi era sparito tutto. Okay, good afternoon. First of all, please allow me to thank the organizers of these two events, Andrea Balbo, Francesco Stella, and Chiara Tommasi. I'm very glad to be a very small part of their SERICA project, which is very important project in the area. And today I will try to be as short as possible because I imagine you're tired. I prepared my presentation in English, despite the title was originally in Italian, because I figured that we had an international audience. And I will briefly talk about how the earliest grammar descriptions of Chinese language were made in Latin. This was quite an enterprise because, as I will say, the earliest works on Chinese language, described Chinese language made by the locals, by Chinese people, were completely different from the Greek-Latin tradition we are accustomed to. So their tradition met with our tradition when the missionaries got there, mainly at the end of the 16th century. So I will briefly say when, where, who began to describe Chinese and how. It's important, of course, to highlight who was the intended readership of this work, which is strongly interconnected with the meta-language used in these works, which is Latin, but also Portuguese and Spanish, which were also global languages at the time, at least in certain parts of the world. And I will briefly talk about some innovations and adaptation process that had to take place in order to describe Chinese grammar with Latin terms. So I fast forward a little bit to say that the first analytic description of Chinese in the way we mean it was made very late in history. It was the Maffei of Ma Dianzhong, and this was at the end of the 19th century. After Ma Dianzhong, the Chinese, of course, with their own studies and differences and research, have kept the model of somehow adjusting it, the Greek-Latin model. But before that, the Chinese themselves had never described their language in these terms. What had they done? It's not that the Chinese had never talked about their language, of course. They began very early to make some early considerations on their language. Already during the Warring States period, the philosopher Sun began questioning himself on what the language was, its purpose, its social role, the relationship between people and their cognitive process. But mainly the Chinese were reflecting on their language because they had to study the classics. Studying the classics was important if you want to become a Mandarin. You would like to start a career as a Mandarin. So many earlier studies were studies on phonology, etymology, and rhetoric linked to this study of the classics. Before any grammatical compilation, the Chinese began very early to have lexical compilation. So we have already at the beginning of the Han Dynasty, we have the first dictionary of words, the Arya. And already during the Western Han, we have a dictionary of dialects or topolects, Fanyan, which is very, very early, very important. The Chinese began to acknowledge the existence of this variety. I wouldn't say sub-varieties, but topolects would be the best translation of Fanyan, I think. And then other dictionaries followed, of course. As for grammar, at some point, Xu Shen, compiling the Shuwenjie realized that there were some words in the sentences that had no particular meaning, but they were particles. They were all kinds of particles. He divided them in final particles, entirety particles, distinctive particles, and later on other scholars acknowledged the existence of these strange words. And they began to call them language helpers. It's a word that's still used nowadays. We would call the particles juts. And that's how they more or less were calling them, helping characters or helping language helpers. The classical, typical definition that it's everywhere, I believe it's also in Premar's grammar that was presented to those of you who were in Siena. I think Anna De Toro talked about this, because Premar is the first one in his grammar to record this fact that the Chinese at some point began to distinguish their words in shizi and xuzi, full words and empty words. Actually, this distinction had been made by a Japanese monk a lot earlier. The Chinese took it. And so with full words, they would intend words with a meaning, a concrete meaning somehow, nouns, verbs, adjectives, and the empty words were adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, what we would call particles, of course. And these went on at some point, the distinction later on during the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Liu Wei, talking about particles, also talked about living words, or dead words. Since, with living words, he meant words that could change meaning, and dead words were those who could not change any meaning, had a more grammatical function. So these, as far as the Chinese studies were concerned, when the Europeans arrived in China. Not talking about the earliest European, not talking about Marco Polo, that phase, because they did not do much about studying the language, but I'm talking about, of course, the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th century, when, after the great geographical discoveries made by the Iberian powers of Spain and Portugal, all these vessels from Europe every year would sail towards the Americas, Spanish boats, and towards East Asia, the Portuguese boats. They would sail yearly around April to have favorable winds from Lisbon. They would circumnavigate Africa and stop in Goa and then in Macau and reach the rest of China and Japan. On the way back, sometimes they would stop in Brazil, which was still part of the Portuguese padroado. On these boats, who traveled on these boats? Of course, merchants, some missionaries, and they all had one need: speaking the language. And this was a need that was very strongly felt, of course, by the Jesuits, because the merchants could even invent some pidgin to use, with just very simple words for trade. But those arriving in China found a very refined society, and they realized that they could not just make them learn Latin, but they had to learn the language first. To understand them first were the missionaries. So at the beginning, they probably looked for some materials that could help them in terms of bilingual dictionaries, but there weren't. There was a Korean-Chinese bilingual dictionary, but no Western Chinese bilingual dictionaries, and there were no grammars in the way they would mean it. So at first what they would do was, of course, try to talk to local speakers as learned as possible. They understood, of course, thanks to the Chinese, that they had to approach the language starting through the classics, and from the Sanzi Jing, I had a picture of the Sanzi Jing, they would start like kids with the classics. And of course, they would use somehow monolingual tools, dictionaries that were available at the time. But the key point is that at some point they would become proficient enough to produce their own tools to help the others. And that's when bilingual dictionaries, grammars, phrasebooks, or even simple word lists would come out. And they came out in at least 3 languages: Latin, Portuguese, and Spanish, as I said, according to who they were targeting. In general, all the missionaries traveling on Portuguese ships, on the ships of the Padroado reaching China, could speak Portuguese. So you find letters of our Italian missionaries written in Portuguese or in Chinese. They were very, I can't say proficient, but they could talk at least and understand and read and write Portuguese. And many also Spanish. But Spanish, I'll go back to this. Latin. Choosing Latin was not just an option. If they chose Latin, it was because they meant the work to be read by superiors, learned people in China, but mainly in Europe. They who chose Latin wanted the work to circulate in Europe. So who really began to study, to describe and to teach and to learn which Chinese? We often neglect this part of the history. I will go through it very briefly. We forget that the first contacts that Westerners had with the Chinese language also actually was in the Philippines. The Dominican missionaries in the Philippines met there some Chinese merchants from Fujian province, and they were speaking Minanhua, Southern Min dialect. These people were called the Sanglays. So they began to study this language, and through them they began to also translate the Confucian classics. So they were the first ones. And of course they were the first people to make transcriptions of the Min dialect and began compiling some tools. So one of them is, for example, Juan Cobo, who has several records on his curriculum. One of them is of having written supposedly an Arte della Lingua China, a grammar of Chinese, but this work has not been found. It's attributed to him in secondary sources. So maybe it will resurface. Maybe he meant to write one and he never did so. The first dictionary that we have of the bilingual dictionary of a Chinese language, Minanhua, and a Western language is this Dictionarium Sinico-Hispanicum that is in Min dialect, written by Pedro Quirino. And then we have this Arte della Lingua QQ, that is this grammar of language. QQ stands for Zhangzhou, which is a province in Fujian, a city in Fujian province. So these were the earliest works. What happens when the Jesuits reached China? I'm quite sure that you know how things went, but mainly thanks to Alessandro Varignano, the Jesuits could really enter China, because he arrived in Macau. He realized that none of the people, of the missionaries that were settled there, could enter China, aside from some short times when there were the Canton fairs and the missionaries would go there to Canton with the merchants. And the main obstacle was the language. There are letters and letters that they have been published of these missionaries that were desperate because they could understand anything of Chinese. So Alessandro Varignano wrote to his superiors in Rome, asked for 2 young missionaries who arrived there, one after the other, first Michele Ruggeri and then Matteo Ricci, and they could finally start studying this very complicated language. This is a short passage of Varignano talking about, making a very brief description of Chinese language, saying anyways that it's complicated, but there's 2 young people that are Ricci and Ruggeri, and they are studying it, and this is the only hope we have to enter China. As a matter of fact, they did compile the first Portuguese and Chinese Mandarin, let's say, dictionary. There are in this dictionary some words that have been recognized as more southern, but this can be considered the first Western Mandarin dictionary, 1588. So this is why Mandarin? Because the Jesuits, not all of them, this is a generalization, but it's mainly true. The Jesuits, of course, to talk to common people, even just for the confessions, they had to learn the dialects, the locally spoken languages. But they had a strategy, and the strategy was to learn Mandarin, to talk to the Mandarins, which is learn Mandarin, Guanhua, the language spoken by the class, the learned class who held the reins of power. So they mainly concentrated their efforts on Mandarin, and their works are about Mandarin. The first grammar in Latin of Mandarin is the one written by Martino Martini. Martino Martini, as well as many, has a lot of world records in his curriculum, but for sure he has written the first, this Grammatica Linguae Sinensis, the first manuscript grammar of Mandarin Chinese. It was compiled between 1651 and 53. And it has been also the first one ever published at the end of the 17th century. He was already dead, but it was published in France as an appendix to Melchizedek Thévenot, Relation des divers voyages Chilia, very famous work. But the first work, the manuscript, is a very small work. You can see here, this is one of the many editions that circulated, because this is the reason why he wrote it in Latin. He wrote it in Latin in the years he was appointed procurator of the China mission. He had to go back to Europe, a report on the situation. It was very complicated, of the missionaries in China. And he knew that also as a procurator, he had to go around European cities collecting money and sponsorship. And so he had a very important publication project of his atlas, his history of China and so on, but also his grammar. And he left a first manuscript of his grammar in Indonesia, in Batavia. And this grammar also from there was sent back to Europe and circulated on its own. But he brought a copy to Europe, and from this copy many others were made, and I found quite a few. I would not surprised to find other ones. But what happened is that even after Martini's death, the grammar was alive and kept circulating. It was adjusted by Couplet, and with Couplet's annotation, it was published. You can see the first page of the published work. Just to briefly conclude, in the 17th century also there was this other grammar of Mandarin by Francisco Varo, but it's in Spanish. And the following grammar in Latin is the one that was presented to those of you who were in Siena, Joseph Henri de Premar, Notizie Lingue Sinice, which is a very, very big work. It's 262 pages, more or less. So, to summarize, and this is also for those of you who are young scholars that would like to put yourself into something very challenging, there are grammars that we know of and that wait to be found. And we know of them through secondary sources. We have this Arte della Lingua China, attributed to Juan Cobo, I told you. There's this other one that could be in Latin, Lingue Sinice, Grammatica et Dictionarium, attributed to the Dominican Domingo de Nieva. This would break Martini's record, so I would be very happy if somebody found it. In the 17th century, actually, many grammars are there that have not been found. The only two ones in Latin are those that I told you about, Martini's and Premar. All the others, they have not been found, but they are in Spanish. 18th century, almost the same situation. We have the Notizie Lingue Sinice, the grammar of Premar, and another grammar in Spanish, this last one, Arte della Lingua Chinica. But we have other grammars that could be found. So there's really a lot of research still to be done in Manila, in China, and who knows. But maybe if they made it to Europe, you could find them in Europe. This is the point. Martini's I could find many copies in Europe because Martini brought it in Europe, had a clear plan, published it in Latin and circulated. Going back very briefly, still a few minutes. So going back to the 17th century, the first grammar of Mandarin in Latin is Martini's. Before Martini, of course, Ricci had given some description of Chinese language in his the Cristiana in the Italian actually version of the Cristiana Spedizione a Puccina, but Martini. We don't know if Martini had read it, but he made a complete different work. He organized his short grammar into 3 chapters. The first is not really a grammar, but it's something that the Chinese found very important and very particular. It's a list of syllables of initials and finals of the Chinese and an explanation of the tones. And you could say that this is not really grammar, it's phonology, but it was fundamental also for to teach the basics of the language, to give this information. So this is very new in the structure. And then you can see second chapter, what could be seen as the full words of Chinese, so nouns, pronouns, verbs. The third chapter has all the other parts of the speech that we are very accustomed to. And you would think like, oh wow, that's very similar to Latin. Indeed, his starting point was very likely the Istituzione Grammatica Libri III of Emanuel Alvarez. It was a book that was very well known at the time, translations, and had gone all over Europe. It was used at the Collegio Romanum. As you see in one part where Alvarez describes the parts of speech, you find more or less the same, even the same order that Martini reproduces. So the basic was that, but Martini was not was somehow trying to make his Western reader more familiar with the subject. But then when he went down in the explanations, of course, immediately he says in Chinese, it's the position that gives you the function. So this is stated right away after the list of the syllables. This list of the syllables is very peculiar, as said, in a grammar. But this could be done because the syllables of Chinese are relatively less than ours, of course. The tones, of course, was something completely different. The concept of tone existed in the West, but it had to be understood in another sense. There was more the concept of intonation in the West. Definitely what Martini does, but also the other grammars in Spanish too, everything that I cannot classify is a particle. So many things are called particles in all these grammars. Definitely he decides to call the particule numeriche the classifiers that we know now as measure words. They went through quite a few names over time, but he could not identify them anyhow, and he called them particule numeriche. And it's funny about declensions and conjugation. How does he talk about that? He has a chapter that is called Nominibus et Eorum Declinatione. Like, how do you talk about that? Simply showing that there is no declension. At least there is no morphological internal change of the word itself, but adding particles or the position of the word, you can have the case. No, you can have dative, genitive. There is an image you can see, for example, where he says position, or the insertion of the can make the genitive. Same thing for the conjugation. Here, I don't know if you see these pictures, maybe it's too dark. He makes the entire declension of I love. And there is the present, and there's the past, and there's the future. Entire declension where the verb I, to love, never changes. What changes is adding liao, the particle, or jiang from the future. No? So the particle for the, let's say, past tense, the protective aspect, and jiang for the future. So, but he's really an instructor in doing this. I show you that there's no declension by showing you a conjugation. Like it's very, very early attempts, but this is how it was done. I think I could stop here for today, so I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you. Quindi siamo giusto.
Thank you for this very clear introduction to a topic knew nothing at all, but I could follow. Now we should have some time for discussion, but very quite brief discussion, because I'm told that we have to leave the meeting by 7. Yeah, so maybe a few questions, and I call Luisa. Maybe we can continue later informally in case, but yeah, if you wanna. So, if there are any questions on all the talks that have been given today, yes.
I actually have a comment for because I think that I've been playing locally for quite some time, and I will stop very soon. But I think that it needs a lot.
Maybe you can come. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank you for your very clear and very interesting presentation. And your presentation convinced me even more of the link between the earlier Jesuit missions and the later Jesuit missions, with Zocoli being a very interesting case study of the study of Chinese language as well, and the teaching of Latin in Chinese. For example, the grammar that you mentioned by advice was translated by Zocoli in Chinese, and Ma Jinzhong and Ma Xiangbo were actually students of Zocoli. So somehow there is always is part of this of the continuation of these earlier attempts as well. And so my comment, first of all, is that to add up to your list of possible works for young scholars, there is a dictionary that Zocoli wrote that it should have been like the Kanishis, then translated into Latin. And it was in 12 volumes, but secondary sources are mentioning it. But I went to Shigawa many times that I couldn't find it. Maybe someone can find it. So, and I listed only. Yeah, exactly. But yes, exactly. So this can be something else. Exactly. And another thing that I wanted to say, and there will be a question, is: do you think, from studying these earlier periods, that somehow this initial endeavor was then a sort of became a sort of blueprint for the Jesuit missionaries also later on, like in the 19th century, or even for Protestant missionaries or other missionaries who have been working on grammars or dictionaries? Thank you.
You can come.
Okay, thank you for your comment and your question. Well, yeah, of course, if we add to that list of grammars, those of the dictionary that need to be found as work for centuries, it is great. As for the link, there is a link. I've been studying recently, you already know, the later grammars, many Cantonese grammars, by Protestant missionaries in China, and of course when they began with Cantonese, they used, the only other reference was the previous grammars had been compiled for Mandarin by previous missionaries. And what is very nice actually is that in the 19th century publishing, literally they would write all the sources, whereas in the 16th, 17th century, they don't always talk about list their sources. So they do refer to the works.
Thank you.
So maybe you can come.
A small comment on the language matter.
Ho tutte le domande tutte a me. Mi sento.
Thank you very much. Yes, a small comment is
you know, the Furtado and E.G. Zhao has translated the category of Aristotle. There is a third part, paronymy. The translation is very difficult. First, homonym, synonym, and paronym. Paronym is exactly conjugation and declination like that. In Chinese case, the important point is how they translate this. So please check this and you may find something. And in relation to this, one thing more is in translation of the Chinese for canons, I mean the classic books, and then they very cautiously noted the number 1, 3, 2, 4, like it's kind of syntax, like the object, like that. That is also very important, and because Julian Stanley, you know, the famous French geologist, has used it later using you're right. Using the Manchurian language. It's the same syntax form like Latin. Then they explain like this, and you can understand. You can use the Manchurian syntax, and you can follow more easily Chinese syntax like that. And so, in case of this book, I would like to maybe help you.
Thank you very much.
There was another question. So just a very big comment to Professor Günther.
Quindi mi posso andare. Fare male ci sto sempre.
Yes, thank you very much, first of all, for your talk, very interesting for me. And I just a little comment on it, because also in the second book of Historiae Indicae, there is a long geographical and ethnological session about Brazil and Brazilians in Brasilia. And I think that it's really impressive, the huge contrast between the session about Brazilians and Chinese, because while describing Brazil, the author don't mention ancient history, ancient Western history, ancient empire, and so on. And there is a total lack of references to antiquity, and the author emphasizes very much the lack of institution and emphasize the wildness of the inhabitants of Brazil. So I think that also, as we read in the quotation from Eco, there is this contrast, this dichotomy between China and. So I think that there is the comparison between sixth and second book really supports the conclusion of your paper. The Chinese empire is a counterpart of Portugal. So just a comment, the comparison, I think that it's struggling and it's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, if not only in book 2, but if you go through all the books, and of course there's not always an ethnographical description and so, but in fact there are few mentions of classical sources. As far, I mean, if I browse through the text, sometimes classical references, authors, phenomena, so are mentioned. So thank you very much for pointing that out again.
I think that it's time for one last question or comment.
And only a little question about the classical sources. Which kind of classical sources? I mean, you quoted Life of Suetonius, but there are other sources of imperial, probably of imperial age, or sometimes because you quoted also Cicero, the Repubblica, and so on with the intermediate part. which sources? Imperial age, Republican age, and which kind of sources? And perhaps why?
I can only follow up on my speaker with the references. Of course, nearly nowhere direct references are mentioned. I think I recall 1 or 2 points. He says, Appian, I have read, and Ptolemaios or so, but it's not in the chapter or the book on China. I think it's very clear that he read Suetonius, but that should not be a surprise. I think also for those doing numismatics at that time, and so Suetonius was a reference work to the Caesars. And the other things, it seems to me that it is just what he has grasped through his uncle, but without then really going into the context of the original work. But just using this knowledge or reframing it and adapting it to the Chinese. The sources about Cicero and so on, I only added as possible references where he could have had his idea from, because this very strange passage about Carthage, I also talked with Professor Mutschler, it's very odd somehow. We would directly link the decline with Rome after the defeat of Carthage, but not that the Carthaginians somehow restricted their empire to their original settlement. So that's just a possible reference. And of course, Cicero's second book, it's very unlikely that he had it at hand at that time. But Cicero's viewpoint is mentioned also in Xenophon, Aristotle, Plato, though that might have also some Greek influence, but that's all not true.
Very last remark, yes.
I will be really quickly. So I have a question to Ki-Hong Kim about the codex of the British Library. I should like to know if there are more information about how this book arrived in the library, if you know something about it, if you can tell us something, because you said it's a kind of new discovery, isn't it? Okay, thank you.
For the time, I will answer very shortly. Please refer to the introduction in the Human Willings translation. So details are very described from the lost history and to the rediscovery of manuscript.
So I think we can close this first day, first session of our conference. I would like to thank all the speakers, and all of you for attending, for your patience as well. Lucky day. Of course, discussion can be continued tomorrow also because